Let me finally, in the context of elements that we need, so these are elements that we need to maintain, that we need to introduce in order to maintain stability. So we need to make sure we maintain obedience to law, that we are respectful of the laws, that we don't see the Constitution as something that we are constantly seeking to amend to serve our own narrow self-interest, but that we reflect its overall or overarching organizational principle. We don't seek to change it all the time. That we avoid the corruption of money into political life. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, he says, constitutions are preserved when their destroyers are at a distance, and sometimes also because they are near, for the fear of them makes the government keep in hand the Constitution. Wherefore, the ruler who has a care of the Constitution should invent terrors and bring distant dangers near, in order that the citizens may be on their guard, and like sentinels in a night watch, never relax their attention. They should invent terrors, they should make people afraid, and bring distant dangers near, in order that citizens may be vigilant. What does that remind us of? What's an example of that? Every time you go through an airport, what happens to you? How are you treated? You're treated as a terrorist. Exactly, right? Every time we go through an airport, we are treated as a terrorist. How many of us are terrorists? And the amazing thing about it is, no common sense is applied. Little infants and superannuated abuelas are equally terrorists in the eyes of the apparatus of airport security. What's the symbolic value of that gesture? It keeps our citizens safe, yes, but what does it remind you of? Of course, it got much worse after 9/11. That's absolutely true. And in fact, it got so much worse after 9/11 that flying is now a real pain in the ass, precisely because of the absurd security checks that we have to go through. But what does the security check remind you of, even if you're not even conscious of it? What does it remind you of? It's a dangerous world. The dangers are everywhere. The people are out there. What do those people want to do? What does the radicalized Islamic terrorist want to do to you? Where do they want to do it? They want to kill you, right? They want to kill you over there. They want to kill you over here. They want to kill you in your home. They want to kill you at your work, on the street. They want to kill you in the theaters or at your schools. They are everywhere. There are these terrors which lurk. Have we not in the West since 2001 constructed an image of the Islamic terrorist as a pervasive threat that lurks everywhere, against which we must be perpetually on guard? How real a threat to the individual is terrorism compared to, say, for example, driving a car or smoking a cigarette? How dangerous is terrorism to the citizen? Is it a danger? Is it a threat?
Yes, but the possibilities are very small.
Statistically, is it a threat? Your chances of dying in a terrorist attack are so infinitesimally tiny that if you were actually to guide your actions based on the statistical likelihood of that happening, you would never drive a car, you would never fly in a plane, you'd never take a train, you wouldn't cross the street, you'd probably avoid most foods, right? In other words, if you're willing to guide your life by the infinitesimally small likelihood that you'll die in a terrorist attack, there are many aspects of your life where there is an equally infinitesimally small likelihood of danger that you will then have to actually redefine your whole pattern of existence. And yet none of us do that. We fly in planes, we take trains, we drive cars, we cross the street, and yet we don't live in fear of those things, but we live in certain fear, a kind of underlying pervasive fear of the external other. What's the value of the Islamic terrorist in a Western liberal democratic model? It's not that they're going to kill us, is it? What's the value that they serve? They remind us of what? What is it the Americans like to say? They remind us of our freedoms, right? They hate us because we're free. Remember that phrase? They hate us because they hate our freedoms. In a way, it's a form of reminding us of what we have. Our well-constituted, well-ordered, constitutional, prosperous society. And they have been constructed into a kind of pervasive other. They don't like our way of life. They don't like the kinds of societies that we have organized. And so therefore, by building up that kind of image, essentially what we've done is it serves a twofold purpose. It gets us a little bit afraid, but it also reminds us to reflect upon and to value the things that we have. And every time there's a terrorist attack, we can see that people mobilize then around these kinds of core political values. When I first read this passage from Aristotle, well, I can't remember when I first read it, but when I read it before teaching, I remember being really struck by it. The ruler who has a care of the constitution should invent terrors and bring distant dangers near. Because to my mind, that phrase sums up very effectively a strategy that we have seen pervade Western thinking, Western liberal democratic thinking over the last 20 years. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm saying it's a striking thing that Aristotle, writing 2,500 years ago, essentially recognized a tool set that we're still using now. It reminds me a little bit, that passage, of something that we saw in the Republic, which was an important feature of one of the questions of the essays one of the essay topics that I set, which was the paternalistic power of the guardians. And to my mind, there's one element of that question that you absolutely have to introduce if you want your essay to be at the highest level. What's the best symbol of paternalistic power over somebody that Aristotle gives to the guardians that nobody else has? It's not the right to marry who they want, or this weird marriage lottery or property in common or anything like this. What are the examples of paternalism that are there? They get to decide what you hear, right? They expel the poets. And they get to lie to you. Remember? They get to lie to you. Why do they get to lie to you? The same reason a parent lies to their child. Because they know better. They know better than you. That's paternalism in action. If you grant to the authority the right to lie to you, you are essentially recognizing the structure of a paternal authority that lies above you. And so on that point, we see both Aristotle and Plato in agreement that well-constituted or stable rule requires then the use of dissimulation, fabrication, as a tool of government. I think the difference is that whereas for Plato, who is willing to incorporate things like censorship and indeed a kind of free reign of dissimulation, for Aristotle, it's much more focused. People, if you make them afraid, will value what they have. And if what they have is worth holding on to, therefore fear can serve a positive purpose. It's a very remarkable phrase. Okay, a couple of other things that I wanted to get to before I come to the last point, which is about education and so on. I wanted to come to this element of, in balance, this question of distribution, because I think it's another subtle point, which when I first read it struck me as quite remarkable. And we see two instances of it here on section. The first mention is at 1272a at lines 15 and following. He says, the common meals of Crete. Remember I talked about the common meals? You remember this? The common meals. Do you remember what the common meal is? That in the ancient Greek polis there was a tradition of having the citizens sit around and show public feasting, basically. The common meals of Crete are certainly better managed than the Lacedaemonian, or the Spartan. For in Lacedaemon, everyone pays so much per head, or if he fails, the law forbids him to exercise the rights of citizenship. It's a pay-to-play system. You have to buy your seat at the table, and if you don't have enough money to buy your seat at the table, you are not a citizen, right? So that's the Spartan model. But in Crete, they are of a more popular character. There, of all the fruits of the earth, of the cattle raised on the public lands, and of the tribute which is paid, one portion is assigned to the gods and to the service of the state, and another to the common meals, so that men, women, and children are all supported out of a common stock. And he picks this up again later in the book, in book 7, as to common meals. So think about the common meal as a metaphor. This is the point where citizens, if you will, come together. It helps to define citizenship, right? How do you get a place at the table? As to common meals, there is general agreement that a well-ordered city should have them. In other words, you want to create fellowship amongst citizens, because remember, what is one of the advantages that the state brings? The capacity for what it calls friendship, right? They ought, however, to be open to all the citizens, and yet it is not easy for the poor to contribute the requisite sum out of their private means, and to provide also for their household. The expense of religious worship should likewise be a public charge. The land must therefore be divided into two parts, one public and the other private, and each part should be subdivided, part of the public land being appropriated to the service of the gods, and the other part used to defray the costs of the common meal. How can we take that idea and translate it into the modern day, do you think? What's he saying? What's he saying in that idea of public, private, and this question of a seat at the table, participation in the common meal, the ability to be a citizen? That your citizenship is not purely a private matter, that the state has an interest in your citizenship, and that therefore the state should take an interest in maintaining the welfare of all of its citizens. Isn't that essentially an argument in favor of forms of redistribution? That the state should allocate or should arrogate to itself public resources and then use those public resources to subsidize the people who live inside the city who are poor. We might today, we wouldn't call it the common meal. What would we call it today?
Taxes.
We call it taxes as the means of redistribution, but what do those taxes do? How would we think about it? Family assistance, for instance, right? The idea that you have family assistance if you have a certain income. Or we might consider it if you are unemployed, that the state will pay you a certain benefit so that you don't suffer too much from a loss of income. Or that it might provide towards your medical or other basic care. In other words, the state, as he says, the best administered state is one in which these kinds of elements, the quality of the welfare of the citizenship, is a public good, a public charge. And that links then to the common interest of the state. Remember, what is the purpose of the state? Remember, we looked at the theory of causes, the material, formal, efficient, and final cause. What's the final cause of the state? What were you trying to achieve? Eudaimonia, right? The flourishing life. These are the things that allow us to get to that flourishing life. He is not, unlike Plato, arguing for a kind of radical communalism. He doesn't argue that we should abolish private property. Quite to the contrary, he embeds the notion of the private and property at the very heart of a well-ordered state, for he says the person who loses their sense of what it means to say something is mine is someone for whom you will not find strong qualities of citizenship. So the notion of ownership is important to the element of citizenship. But what's the principle he introduces at the beginning of the book? Moderation. And so therefore you don't want to end up in a situation where some have so few that they are excluded from the very rights of citizenship. Therefore that should become a public charge, a public interest, as reflected then in this ritual of the common meal. It's worth repeating that it ought to be open to all citizens, and therefore the state should take it on as a public charge. To me, this is, again, a very striking feature of the Aristotelian political project, because as he's thinking through what is the best politics that we should have, he touches upon a remarkable number of things that I think we can see in our own political society that we are still grappling with. And it's important to remember that these are not utopian ideas, things that cannot be implemented. The point about it is this is what we should be working towards. We should be working towards a state that can implement these kinds of things. Okay, I have only a few last things to go through. Let me finally talk about education. It's found at the beginning of Book 8. It says, "No one will doubt that the legislator should direct his attention." Note, ladies, it's always his. See how times have changed. No one will doubt that the legislator should direct his attention above all to the education of youth. For the neglect of education does harm to the Constitution. It is therefore necessary for the practice of excellence. And since the whole city has one end, namely the ability to allow its own citizens to flourish, it is manifest that education should be one and the same for all, and that it should be public and not private. You should not have the right to educate your children in a way that is distinct from others, because education drives the very underlying constitutionalism of the state. That education should be regulated by law and should be an affair of state is not to be denied. It's interesting to note that one of the first reforms that was introduced in modern Spain after the end of the Franco era was what? It was the secularization of the education system and moving all education onto a common publicly determined curriculum away from the idea of a private education that could actually then use its very private status to impart specific values to young people. Education is the breeding ground of the values of the state and therefore should be a public charge. Doesn't necessarily have to be paid for by the state in the sense you have to have public teachers, but the things you learn, that is a matter of public interest. And it's fundamental then that the state take over this public charge of education because it is required for the pursuit of the excellence of the citizen. And in this way, through education, the excellence of the citizen and the excellence of the individual actually then come together. This is how the book ends, with this kind of unity of these two elements. And he has the whole, I don't know, those of you who read the entire book, he talks about gymnastics and music and all the other things that you're supposed to learn at school, because that's what makes the excellent person, right? In the ancient Greek world, a knowledge of music, a knowledge of gymnastics, a knowledge of rhetoric and so on, this made you a good person. But the point is that the state plays a political role. It's a site for the creation of common values and a common sharing of the Constitution. And it also is the place where you create good citizens. It is through your education that you nurture those qualities which will ultimately determine your excellence as an individual. And so the role of education as a public charge, as a public good, is fundamental then to an optimal or a normative political scheme, because that's where the good citizen and the good man come together, right? This is the central principle. What then is Aristotle's political theory? What does he leave us with at the end of this book? What are our key takeaways that we can say about this book? I think the first thing that we can say is that the study of politics is supreme. That politics is not some kind of side issue. That politics is one of the most important forms of inquiry. Indeed, we might even say it is the most important form of inquiry, because politics is how the very nature of human beings is expressed. Remember that we are by nature what kind of animals? Political animals. Therefore, the study of politics is actually the study of who? Ourselves. The study of politics is the study of ourselves. To pursue better politics is therefore, we can read it as a form of self-improvement. It helps to make us better. To strive for political change is not an abstract, distant project. It is a personal project because of the way that we are all implicated in politics. That means further that as part of his political theory, that it is incumbent upon all of us to acquire a political skill that we may engage in political conversations. Remember that the nature of what defines politics is our logos. Logos is defined as persuasive speech, remember? Yes. Speech that is reasonable, but speech that is reasonable. I shouldn't just say, by the way, it's not just persuasive speech. Persuasion is a two-way street, isn't it? I can persuade and I can be persuaded. So by say persuasive speech, it means both the capacity to persuade others as well as the logos to be persuaded by others. And so I think the other element of his political theory is that it implicates us in the nature of the political conversation. As political animals, we cannot be like Socrates. We cannot simply go home. Going home isn't an option, because wherever we go, we carry our politics with us. And so it is a kind of imperative that we think through these problems. And finally, I think Aristotle's political theory is inspiring. I think that it's trying to drive us in its recognition that politics is an art, that like any other art, like playing piano or painting, the more we practice it, the better that we will get. That therefore it holds out the hope that if we can simply acquire the necessary skill, we will get a better politics than the one we have now, assuming that our politics is not perfect. And so the normative element of Aristotle's political vision is, in a sense, an imperative. It's a charge that we should work towards not the politics that we have, but we should work towards the politics that we deserve. And we deserve a better politics because we are by nature political animals, and it is through our politics that we will achieve this form of human flourishing. And so it is a mandate amongst all individuals that they seek to engage with each other and with their society in ways that can drive our system forward to achieve a politics that we deserve. A final thought, because isn't that mandate, isn't that imperative now more than ever of critical importance in our society? The problems that we face cannot be solved with reference to market economy solutions. They must be solved politically. And therefore, if we are to be able to change the current course that we are on, do we not need a better politics? Do we not deserve a better politics? If we let our current political system simply allow our economies to spew out carbon year after year in the same quantities that we've been doing, knowing full well that by the end of the 21st century, many of our major cities will be underwater, large numbers of countries will be uninhabitable, millions or hundreds of millions of people will be under severe threat. The solution to that problem is what? Political. It is a political problem, and it requires a political solution. The fact that our current politics is incapable of responding to the threats that we can see visibly in front of us, because it is too much protected by or constrained by special interests or short-term thinking. It seems to me that if we were looking for a way to craft a message that helped us to overcome the narrowness and the self-destructiveness that embeds, we could do worse than to look at Aristotle's political ideas. Because that's what Aristotle is telling us. Don't be passive. Don't be retiring. Don't be Socratic. Go home. Don't go home. Go out and advocate for the politics that we deserve, because this is what we can do. We are not powerless in this way, because politics is something that we can all practice.